In the fading light of a dying empire, the thunder of hooves echoed across the horizon like the heartbeat of an approaching doom. Dust clouds rose where once proud legions marched in perfect formation, but now the armies themselves had become the harbingers of collapse. This is the story of how military forces, meant to protect and expand civilizations, instead accelerated their irreversible end. Across centuries of human history, from the sun-baked frontiers of Rome to the blood-soaked steppes of Asia, armies did not merely fight wars, they unraveled the very fabrics of societies that had grown too vast, too strained, and too fragile to endure. The collapse did not arrive with a single battle cry. It crept forward on the boots of soldiers, the wheels of supply wagons, and the ambitions of generals who believed they could outrun entropy itself. The Western Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries stood as the mightiest edifice of human organization the world had yet known. Spanning from the misty shores of Britannia to the deserts of North Africa, its roads, aqueducts, and marble cities symbolized an order that seemed eternal. Legions of disciplined soldiers had forged this realm through conquest and consolidation, their iron discipline and engineering prowess turning wilderness into provinces. Yet beneath the surface of imperial glory lay an economy stretched thin by constant frontier defense, a population burdened by heavy taxation, and a political core increasingly corrupted by intrigue. Daily life in the provinces carried on with a deceptive rhythm. Farmers tilled fields under the watchful eyes of local magistrates, merchants traded goods along well-paved highways, and citizens gathered in forums to debate laws that still echoed the Republic's ideals. Children played in the shadows of triumphal arches, while veterans retired to small holdings, their scars a quiet testament to past victories. The scent of olive oil and baked bread filled market squares, and the Latin tongue bound a diverse empire in shared administration. No one yet sensed that the guardians of this world, the armies, were transforming into agents of its dissolution. Early warning signs flickered like distant lightning on the empire's edges, invisible to most living in the secure heartlands. Barbarian tribes, pressured by migrations from the east, pressed against the Rhine and Danube rivers. Roman intelligence reports spoke of Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns in fragmented dispatches, but these were dismissed as manageable border skirmishes. The army, once a professional force of citizen soldiers, had evolved into a patchwork of foederati. Barbarian mercenaries granted land and pay in exchange for service. Economic inflation eroded the denarius, making it harder to equip and feed troops. Emperors rotated through the purple with alarming speed, each relying on military loyalty bought with donatives, rather than earned through shared purpose. Yet in the villas of Gaul and the baths of Rome, life proceeded with familiar comforts. Senators debated philosophy, while tax collectors squeezed the curiales, the local landowners whose wealth funded the legions. The signs were there. Desertions increased, recruitment faltered, and entire units began operating with growing autonomy, but the empire's vastness masked the fractures. No one understood what was coming next. As the 4th century deepened, rising tension wrapped the empire like gathering storm clouds. The Huns' westward surge acted as a catalyst, displacing Gothic tribes who sought refuge inside Roman territory. In 376 AD, thousands of Visigoths crossed the Danube, permitted entry by Emperor Valens, amid promises of military aid. What began as controlled settlement devolved into chaos, as corrupt officials exploited the refugees, sparking rebellion. Armies that should have defended the borders now turned inward, clashing with their own supposed allies. Civil wars between rival claimants drained treasuries further, with generals marching legions against one another instead of external threats. Supply lines strained under the weight of endless campaigns. Grain shipments from Africa arrived late, or not at all. In frontier forts, soldiers whispered of unpaid wages and broken oaths. The once invincible Roman military machine, bloated by size and divided by loyalty to individual commanders rather than the state, began to consume the resources it was meant to protect. Daily routines in border towns shifted from trade to fortification, as rumors of approaching hosts spread like wildfire through anxious populations. Key decisions and fatal mistakes compounded the instability with ruthless precision. Emperor Valens, eager for military glory, confronted the Visigoths at Adrianople in 378 AD without waiting for reinforcements from his co-emperor. The resulting battle was a catastrophe. Roman legions were encircled and slaughtered. Valens himself killed, and the myth of Roman invincibility shattered. Subsequent emperors like Theodosius attempted integration, but the reliance on barbarian generals, men like Stilicho, half Vandal by birth, created dangerous power centers. Heavy taxation to fund these hybrid armies crushed small farmers into serfdom or banditry. Policies of land grants to foederati diluted Roman cultural cohesion, as settled warriors retained their tribal identities and customs. Pressures mounted from within and without. The army's need for recruits led to lowered standards, incorporating more undisciplined elements, while corruption siphoned funds meant for fortifications. By the early 5th century, the Western Empire's military had become a voracious entity, its maintenance accelerating economic decline rather than halting it. The collapse did not begin with chaos, it began quietly, in the ledgers of quartermaster officers and the divided loyalties of field commanders. The moment the system began to fail arrived with visceral finality in the sack of Rome in 410 AD. Alaric, a Visigothic king who had risen through Roman ranks, led his army. Veterans of imperial service now turned against their former masters, through the gates, after a prolonged siege. For 3 days the eternal city endured plunder, temples stripped, palaces burned, and streets filled with the cries of the fallen. The psychological blow reverberated across the Mediterranean. If Rome could fall to an army that had once served it, what hope remained for the provinces? Subsequent waves followed. Vandals under Gaiseric crossed into Africa, seizing the empire's breadbasket, while Hunnic hordes under Attila ravaged the Balkans and Gaul. Roman field armies, fragmented and under strength, could no longer project power effectively. Cities emptied as populations fled to defensible hills or submitted to new overlords. The intricate web of taxation, administration, and trade that sustained the legions disintegrated, as roads fell into disrepair and coinage lost value. Armies that once enforced order now accelerated fragmentation, carving out personal fiefdoms amid the ruins. Human consequences unfolded in waves of suffering that scarred generations. Famine stalked the land as agricultural production collapsed under disrupted labor and marauding bands. Refugees choked the remaining highways, carrying what little they owned while disease spread in their wake. Families that once celebrated Saturnalia now huddled in fear behind crumbling walls, the silence broken only by distant war horns or the crackle of burning villas. Social breakdown accelerated as central authority evaporated. Local strongmen and barbarian kings filled the vacuum, their retainers enforcing a harsher, more arbitrary rule. Slavery and serfdom blurred into new feudal bonds, while literacy and classical learning retreated into isolated monasteries. Children born in this era knew only a world of diminished horizons, where stories of past glories seemed like myths from another age. The fear was palpable, a constant undercurrent of uncertainty that eroded trust between neighbors and classes. Armies, far from providing security, had become instruments of predation, their movements dictating survival or annihilation for entire communities. In the long term, the historical impact reshaped the trajectory of Western civilization in profound and enduring ways. The fall of the Western Roman Empire marked the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages, fragmenting Europe into successor kingdoms where Germanic law mingled with Roman remnants. Military structures evolved into feudal levies, with armored knights replacing massed legions, a direct legacy of the hybrid armies that hastened the end. Trade networks contracted, urban life declined, and the preservation of knowledge became a fragile monastic endeavor. Yet seeds of renewal persisted. The Church emerged as a stabilizing force, and Roman legal and linguistic foundations influenced emerging states. The armies that accelerated collapse inadvertently cleared space for new political entities: Visigothic Spain, Frankish Gaul, Ostrogothic Italy, whose descendants would one day build toward modern Europe. The event underscored a timeless truth: when military institutions prioritize short-term survival and expansion over sustainable governance, they become the architects of their society's undoing. Even as the Western Empire crumbled, echoes of similar dynamics reverberated through other civilizations, proving the pattern was no anomaly. In the East, the Byzantine Empire faced its own military strains, culminating centuries later in the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, where Janissary forces and siege artillery delivered the final blow to the last Roman remnant. Further afield, the Mongol hordes under Genghis Khan and his successors exemplified armies as engines of apocalyptic transformation, toppling the Khwarezmian Empire and weakening Song China through relentless mobility and terror tactics that outpaced administrative recovery. These conquests accelerated collapses by shattering irrigation systems, decimating populations, and imposing tribute economies that stifled innovation. Each case revealed how professional or nomadic warriors, driven by logistical imperatives and martial ethos, could precipitate ruptures far beyond initial battlefields. The dust of their passage left landscapes altered, societies reconfigured, and memories haunted by the speed of transformation. The reflective weight of these histories lingers like smoke over ruined forums. Armies, forged in the crucible of necessity to defend glory and order, often sowed the very seeds of entropy they sought to repel. Their marches consumed resources at unsustainable rates, their hierarchies bred ambition that fractured unity, and their violence normalized brutality that eroded civic bonds. In the quiet aftermath, survivors rebuild amid ghosts of aqueducts and watchtowers, whispering tales of what was lost. The process of collapse was never a singular cataclysm, but a grinding acceleration, propelled by the very forces entrusted with preservation. As modern societies maintain vast military establishments amid their own complex pressures, the ruins of the past offer silent counsel. The legions faded into legend, their standards buried under layers of earth and time, yet the lesson endures. When armies outgrow the civilizations they serve, they hasten the end not with defeat alone, but with the inexorable weight of their existence. What remains is a haunting tableau of impermanence. Empty colosseums stand as monuments to vanished crowds, overgrown with ivy that whispers in the wind. The rivers that once carried Roman galleys now flow past forgotten milestones, indifferent to the dramas enacted on their banks. Historians sift through shards of pottery and corroded sword blades, piecing together narratives of hubris and consequence. In this silence, one senses the fragility of all orders built on martial foundations. The armies that accelerated the end did not merely conquer. They revealed the limits of human endeavor, the point where protection becomes predation, and expansion invites dissolution. Their story is not one of simple villains or heroes, but of a profound historical rhythm, where the guardians of yesterday become the catalysts of tomorrow's uncertain dawn. And in that rhythm, civilizations rise, strain, and ultimately yield to forces they themselves unleashed.